I want to start with probably the fear of missing out and kind of how that affects people and also the positive and negative connotations in that. Do you want to start us off?
I think also touching on some of Carl Jung's theories and I suppose talking more about how you can take control of your life rather than let life happen to you.
I agree. Yeah, kind of that take action piece instead of allowing things to happen to you, then either being pulled from them or just reacting to them.
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, when you're discussing the fear of missing out, what does that mean to you?
Well, the implication of the phrase fear of missing out, you're talking about missing out on what? A situation, say it could be a job promotion, it could be any broad array of things. I think today, we probably will break down the two aspects of it. I think there is a positive and a negative aspect of the fear of missing out. Like you can look at it in terms of the pop culture thing of, oh, well, I'm missing out on that party or I'm missing out on that event with my friends. I'm missing out on that festival. But I think you can also look at it as, well, maybe I'm missing out on a job promotion, or I'm missing out on a business venture, or I'm missing out on being in the healthiest state, say. So I think if we break it down into those two categories, I think we can probably actually come away with something practical and useful in everyday life.
When you talk about the fear of missing out, though, I think most people would associate it with a negative connotation. Kind of, I'm missing out on a fun time or a festival, but you're saying you can also miss out on a business opportunity. And maybe that fear can encourage you to go on and do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the pop culture version of it, clearly, especially in our culture, the Australian culture, there is a rite of passage when you're a youth. You go out, you party, you drink, you have a good time. So obviously there is a reason why that phrase has developed. But yeah, I'd say looking at the other perspective, we can provide some value, hopefully.
When you talk about the biological side of things, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, obviously we have chemical reactions and certain hormones get released in certain situations. So I think understanding like perhaps how your brain's structured and how the different chemical processes respond to certain situations, I suppose.
I'm assuming you're talking about kind of that serotonin and dopamine
100%
combination, yeah. So in regards to that dopamine, say you go out there and you do something, pleasurable. What is the impact of that instant dopamine hit in the time and then also, the day after or whatnot?
Well, I mean, if you look at how the dopamine system works, most of the dopamine is released in the pursuit of something. So you'll get dopamine when you think of the idea. You'll get a release of dopamine while you're moving towards the goal. The goal could be anything. Your goal could be the social event with your friends on the weekend, but it also could be the marathon you've been training for. So as you progress towards the goal and you perceive yourself to be actually progressing, you'll get that dopamine release. Whereas if you don't think you're progressing, you won't get a dopamine release. But basically, when you actually do achieve the goal, you will get a release of dopamine. But the interesting thing is, after that release, your dopamine will actually drop below baseline. So I think it's a bit of a fallacy that you can just chase that instant gratification, because ultimately most of the dopamine is released in the pursuit of the goal. I would say that's pretty important to realize.
I think that's quite interesting because, just going out and doing things, it's actually a pursuit that's going to give you the most dopamine as opposed to just, when you go out to a party, you get a dopamine hit probably thinking about the good time as opposed to when you get there and the day after. Correct. It's kind of that downfall. I think most people would experience that. But when you talk about serotonin, talk more about that.
Well, serotonin is more associated with feelings of well-being. And I'm pretty sure it's actually been linked quite heavily to your gut and how actually a lot of the production occurs in your stomach. So I think even linking health, diet, would actually be a interesting point of topic, I would say. When you're looking at pursuing goals, and I think today we should probably focus more on that, it is more heavily, I suppose, situated with the dopamine reward system. So we probably will steer a bit away from the serotonin. That might be a bit of a different episode, I would say. But yeah, I would say goal setting, looking at personality factors, looking at value hierarchies as well. I think we should step into that a little bit, but there's a few topics we can head down.
When you talk about value hierarchies, I assume you're relating to the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Do you want to get into that and talk more about that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Maslow was a humanistic psychologist. Yeah. He basically had this hierarchy of needs, and it puts things on the top of the hierarchy. You need food, you need water. Underneath that, you need security. The fear of violence, obviously, you need to have a certain level of security. But the one that was actually directly below that was the need to belong to a group, which is pretty interesting because it puts things below that, like the need to achieve and even self-esteem. So the need to belong to a group is actually more important than, say, achieving some external physical goal. So when you look at that, it has pretty big implications for not just how you should live your life, but also how you need to structure it, I would say.
Do you think that need to belong is more important though, more important the pursuit of chasing a goal or something you're aligning with? Because, we are social creatures, and I think everybody has that need to fit in and belong and find people. But is that really, when you talk about the hierarchy, is that more important than trying to go out there and have a crack?
I think the question is, how can I have both?
Yeah.
Because I think the trap that people fall in is, well, I need to belong, I need to have intimate connections, and I'm going to do anything I can to have that. Even if the person, say, doesn't align with other values, other things that I might hold true to myself, I'll actually subjugate myself just so I can have that intimate connection. But I think you need to structure your life, and you need to be self-aware of the fact that I need to have intimate connection. I need to actually find people that are willing to have that intimate connection, and that I don't have to do things that don't align with my, I suppose, true self and my values, I would say.
But to find that balance, probably at some point you're going to have to be imbalanced and say, I'm going to sacrifice one for the other, because it's going to be hard along the way to try and find, that group of people while also trying to, pursue things you want to pursue. Do you think at some point you have to sacrifice one to get the other, or can you simultaneously strive towards both?
It's a difficult question, and I think it is circumstantial. There are going to be some people that do have the ability to just to seamlessly transition into another group, into other friendships and stuff. But I think for the majority, there is going to be an alone period, I would say. And I think being aware of that before you go in is going to be beneficial, I would say. Because if you're not aware of it, then I think you just instantly become reactive. Yeah. All of these emotions swell, and you sort of think, you get lost along in the process, and you go, well, why am I even doing this? Like, I'm suffering here.
Yeah.
It was better for me when I was a part of the group, so I may as well go back to that. But if you go into it with the realization, this is going to be momentary, it's going to be temporary, eventually I'm going to find the people that align with me, And I'm going to have both. I'm going to have the best of both worlds. So I think self-awareness in that aspect is key.
Kind of understanding what you're in for.
Absolutely.
When you talk about that alone period, though, it's not necessarily a bad thing, though, is it?
Well, what happens when you're alone? It forces you to listen to your thoughts, I would say. I would say everyone has an internal voice that reacts to the external world in a way that the emotions are the byproduct of that. So say if you're someone that deep down ambition is important to you, and you live in a reality where you don't have the opportunity to pursue things to a degree that would be fundamental and valuable to you, well, that internal voice is going to struggle against that, I would say. But when you go into a period of being alone, you're going to be forced to confront that, I would say. It's going to be hard. You're going to struggle. There's going to be a lot of negative emotions that are going to come up. But ultimately, I think you're going to come away with that more self-aware and more in a position to head in a direction that aligns with your inner self, I would say.
So it's pretty much a moment of self-reflection, and you probably come out of that period of time more aware of who you are, and I suppose probably better for it and other people.
100%. I think it ties into this concept. We've talked a bit about Carl Jung before, but he had this theory of individuation, and basically that humans have a desire to become a complete version of themselves, basically. We have a certain personality that lends itself to certain things. Some people might be more extroverted. Some people might be better at technical stuff. Some people might be more naturally aggressive. But he says that basically in life, you should be striving to incorporate everything into your personality. So I think when we look at things that incite fear in you, we've talked about this before. The things that you're most fearful of indicates that there's growth to be had. And instead of shying away from fear, ultimately you should look in that area the most, because that's where you're going to learn the most. So when you look at the process of individuation and I suppose creating a whole self, well, how do you go about that? That would be the question you'd ask.
When you're talking about a whole self and he talks about, a complete personality, is that kind of aligning with his Maslow's hierarchy of needs? And, you got to have the food, obviously, the financial backing, you got to have that social group, and you also have that striving towards your goals. I think when we talk about completeness, it's probably a combination of those three things.
100%. I think if you look at what it takes to be successful, you need to have all pillars in place, I would say. You need to know how to communicate. You need to know how to use your aggression in a way that's controlled. That's not easy to do. There's a lot of people walking around that are passive aggressive because they don't know how to control their aggression. So I think learning how to incorporate all parts into your personality. So if we want to dive into, I suppose, just one aspect of it, it'd be something called shadow integration. Shadow is basically, in Jung's theory, all parts of your personality that were either repressed as a child or told that it was unacceptable in the situation, basically. So say if you were someone that naturally is an ambitious person and you grew up in a family that regarded ambition as a negative thing, and you had to repress that urge that drive to ambition, say, as you get older, that drive's not going to go away. It's just going to stay under the surface, and it's going to get triggered along the way. So for example, say if you've grown up, you're an ambitious person, but your community has told you, well, that's not acceptable. You get to 30 and say a coworker comes to you and they get a promotion or something like that. All of a sudden you start having all these feelings. You might start to feel resentful, start to be passive aggressive towards that person. You might not ultimately realize why you're doing it. But in the context of this theory, it would basically tell you that that's your inner ambition trying to come out. You're feeling jealousy and resentment because in yourself, you desire, say, that promotion for yourself. And because you haven't realized that in your personality, you're going to be possessed by these negative emotions. Basically, this theory is suggesting you need to become self-aware of that. And you need to move to a point where you can actually become ambitious without feeling like you're not allowed, basically.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
You know, it's very interesting to hear it from that point of view.
Mm.
And also when you talk about that restrictive kind of childhood, or you come from a community that doesn't, I guess, allow you to express yourself. I think when you're young, it's probably easy to look at that and say, yeah, he's a young kid. He's come from a difficult upbringing. But as you get older, you kind of have to take responsibility for yourself. So what are some maybe tools that, if you are coming from that sort of background, that you can use? Say you are ambitious, you know, what do you do? You can't just sit there and say, you know, my family brought me up to not be ambitious, so it is what it is.
I would say you can start by not having a victim mentality.
Yeah.
These negative emotions you're feeling, don't identify with them as, oh, this is my depression or this is my anxiety. Those feelings are just a byproduct of something deeper.
Yeah.
I think if you become conscious of that, then you can start to work towards that. The problem is when you listen to other people over yourself, that's when things start to get messy. So I'd say really becoming introspective about the feelings that you're having, understand that they don't have to be there forever. And yeah, looking to see, well, why am I having these feelings? I would say that's the first step, the self-awareness.
The self-reflection is pretty much what you're saying.
If you look at passive aggressiveness, say in a friendship or an intimate relationship, it's indirect in nature. Whereas if you look at overt aggression, it's direct communication.
Yep.
Ultimately, you want to sort of fuse both together. You don't want to have aggression for the sake of aggression, because that can just turn violent and it can turn unproductive, say. But you don't want to have purely passive communication, because ultimately the situation will never get solved if all your communication is passive. So you want to look to be able to have controlled aggression that is direct. The question is, well, how do I get to the point where I can be aggressive and controlled? And going back to this idea of being unbalanced, so that in the future you can be balanced, I don't think it's any different in the case of learning to control your aggression. You can do it in many ways. I think typically you would look at, say, someone's overly sensitive. Well, that person could sign up to a boxing gym today, and learning to be physical and be physically aggressive actually would translate in many other areas of your life. Obviously, that's just a straightforward example. You can look at pushing yourself in some other domain. So whether it be you have a real hobby that you really love and you want to turn it into a business, say, you want to turn it into something maybe you can earn money from. By pushing yourself and pushing your limits, you have to use some level of aggression. And the harder you push yourself, the more aggressive you have to be. But ultimately, that's going to allow you to be able to control that aggression, and it's going to translate into other areas of your life. So I think down the track, we should look at other ways you can push yourself, to be able to control that aggression, I would say.
I think Peterson talks about that a lot. He says you should be overly aggressive, but you should learn how to control it.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is when you showcase aggression, say you are mentally passive, but you go out there and sign up for a boxing class, that physical aggression can actually translate into mental aggression. And maybe in the workplace, you can be more direct in a, inviting way, not, screaming and shouting at people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the features of passive aggressiveness, you're looking at jealousy, you're looking at resentment, you're looking at these really toxic traits that are actually in the long term worse than, say, just straight up aggression.
Yeah.
At least with the straight up aggression, it's instantaneous. We can move past it straight away. But yeah, if you're looking at optimally aligning it, you want to be direct but controlled, I would say.
That passive aggression's kind of like unresolved issues just bickering in the background, and then they may come out here and there, but that's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, the reason you're feeling these negative emotions, like we touched on before, is because it's ultimately hitting some nerve in you. It might be that the other person's annoying and there might be something wrong with the other person's behavior, but ultimately I think it comes back to taking responsibility for yourself and understanding, well, this person's stirring up a negative emotion in me because, if you relate to Carl Jung's theory, because there's something repressed in myself that I need to come to terms with.
Yeah, well said. I want to sort of venture towards talking about the brain a little bit and kind of like, I guess, the chemicals in the brain and the science behind it.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're not overly aware in that space. And I think it would be interesting to have someone come on who, is a brain scientist and kind of, pick at him and ask him questions. But when we talk about doing things we don't want to do, how important do you think that voluntary discomfort is? Just for everyone on a day-to-day basis, and not necessarily in a physical or an exercise capacity, but just in general, engaging in activities or things you don't want to do.
Well, how about I ask you this? How do you achieve a goal?
I think to achieve any goal, there's going to be an aspect of doing things you don't want to do. So the pursuit of anything is going to involve an aspect of voluntary discomfort.
Would you say that willpower is something that would be integral to that process?
Absolutely. I think willpower is quite important.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting, I think on the Huberman podcast with Goggins, I believe it is, Huberman discusses, I'm pretty sure it's called the anterior cingulate cortex of the brain.
Yeah.
And he's pretty much, to cut a long story short, he pretty much details how doing things you don't want to do develop that area of the brain. For example, say you love running and you get up every morning and run 12 Ks. Because of your passion and your loving for that activity, it's actually not going to develop that area of the brain. But if I, for example, I'm not a runner, I hate running, I've put on a bit of weight and I absolutely resent that I have to get up at 5 a.m. and go for a 12K run. But if I get up and do it, and if I have the willpower to do it, it's actually going to develop that area of the brain.
Yeah.
So it's quite an interesting segment because essentially you're looking at the same activity. In this case, it's running.
Yep.
Me and you are going to run tomorrow morning. You love to run. I hate to run, but we're both going to do the same activity. But that part of my brain's going to develop and that part of your brain's not going to develop because of our attitude to it.
That's really interesting because I think you can also come away with that as it's a progressive idea as well, because something that's hard now isn't going to be hard in 5 years. So you have to continually be putting that bar higher and higher. Would you agree?
That's exactly right. Yeah. In the case of running, if I do that for 6 months straight, part of me at some point is going to go, you know what, I'm starting to enjoy this. And then when that happens, that part of my brain stops developing. So it's a constant progression where you got to say to yourself, I got to find things I don't want to do and do them for the pursuit of something greater. Now, that's not to say that you should just look at your life and never give yourself any sort of pleasure or enjoyment. I think that's not the idea here. But I think it's quite interesting when you talk about that brain development. And there's a lot of science around this. I think a recent science that talks about how important it is to do things you don't want to do.
We touched on this a little while ago, and we've talked about it quite a bit. But if you're fearful of something, what is the attitude do you think that you should have toward it?
Like we talked about fear a bit earlier in the episode, but I would say if you're fearful towards something, it's not necessarily an indication that you shouldn't do it. I would say quite the opposite. You know, if you are fearful of going for that run or approaching your boss or whatever it is, I think it's probably an indication that you should venture that way. It's the fearful nature of not wanting to do it that indicates to me that you probably should do it. You know, what do you think about that?
Well, we did talk about this last episode, the fact that two people can look at a situation, go through stressful events, and have two separate outcomes. Yeah. Do you want to maybe venture into what occurs when you change your perspective around something?
Well, yeah, I think it's quite similar to what we just talked about, you know, that attitude towards doing things you don't want to do. I think your attitude towards stress from the brain sense is quite similar. I think if two people go through a really stressful situation and one believes that stress is a good thing and this is going to develop me, that person's going to actually showcase health benefits. I think we talked about this in the case of the rat.
Yeah.
That person's actually going to come out of that situation much more beneficial than the person who thinks that stress is a negative thing. And again, that comes down to your attitude and perspective and things and on the situation.
Yeah, how powerful is the mindset?
I think it's just so interesting to me, like the brain, the power of it, and that your idea about something can determine the result of it. And I think we've touched about this, you know, a fair amount today, but I think that just blows my mind.
Well, I mean, even just for an ad hoc example, there's been stories about therapists with clients that have basically adhered to this ideology, because there is a sect of psychology that basically attributes all negative outcomes later in life to traumatic childhood events. Basically, they found that these psychologists were so caught up on that the clients they had started creating fake situations that had occurred in their childhood and had come away actually more traumatized than when they had come in. So that's basically saying that you can change your perspective either positively or negatively in a way that is actually observable in life, I would say.
And that's all based on your perspective, though, which is quite insane. Talking about the mind and the brain, how important do you think, or, you know, how does environment tie into that? I guess if you're around the wrong people or you're in a household that you maybe don't want to be in, how does that affect your mind and also how you act?
You know, when you look at trauma and PTSD, they have found that the people that are most traumatized and have persistent PTSD are the ones that have faced a situation that was so large and so big that basically it had crumbled their perspective of what they thought the world was. Interestingly, the people that are able to move past traumatic situations are the ones that are able to look at the situation and actually confront the situation. The difficulty with that is obviously there are some situations that are so large and might only happen once or twice in your life that it might be difficult for you to go back and try and confront it. But there are still implications there that if something has happened to you that has had a really negative impact on your life, I think you can either let it define you, and I think you can allow it to have a hold on your life, or you can ultimately actually do something about it. You can look to confront the situation again, if that's possible. Maybe you can confront a person or you can confront a situation, but moving forward, understanding that it is in your control, I would say. And I think this gets back to the notion of life that things are always going to progress as well. You can either choose to let life pull you forward or you can actually get out in front of life.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that statement, or?
I would, and you're kind of touching on there towards the end about, do you want to be proactive or just reactive about things? But I think definitely the things that happen to you define you. I think you can let things pull you back forever, or you can accept the situation in the moment and, you know, in a way be better for it in the long run.
Yeah, understanding that I have control. I'm not going to let life just happen to me. There are some things that I can't control, but the things that I can, I'm going to take control of, basically.
Yeah, 100%. I think, again, this kind of ties back to the fear factor of things that we talked about and how you should venture towards the things you're fearful of.
I suppose to conclude, this episode has sort of just touched on some brief... It's touched briefly on, I suppose, fear, motivation, and reward. And I suppose it has outlined that life is a progression. We're always going to be moving forward. You can either do something about it and take control of your life, or you can let life happen to you.
Yeah.
So I would say moving forward, the next few episodes will probably try and move more in depth on these topics, because they're not just something you can cover in an hour or two. It will take a bit of time, but yeah, just understanding that you have control, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And at the end of the day, these are just our opinions as well. We're going to, you know, seek to get some experts on here, and I think particularly around the brain and the chemistry in there, I think would be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in.